Welcome to the Undragoned podcast, focusing on fortifying the people of God and slaying dragons.
All right, for this episode, I am joined by Dr. Joe Rigney. He is the president of Bethlehem College Seminary, as well as the associate professor of theology and literature. He's the author of numerous books. We'll be talking about one of them today. And if I remember correctly, this is your inaugural book, right, Dr. Rigney?
This was the very first one that I wrote. It's got to be almost a decade ago now.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, I remember reading it. It was in my early 20s. So I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago.
Yeah.
But, I really enjoyed reading it then. Excited to talk about it with you today. And thanks for being on the pod.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Awesome. So to kind of talk about the season of Undragoned real quick, we're in the middle of a season that's focused on biblical anthropology, one of the great battlegrounds of our generation, for sure. What is a man? What is a woman? Questions of that nature. And so you wrote a book called Live Like a Narnian, sounds like, 9 or 10 years ago. Christian discipleship in Lewis's Chronicles. And so obviously, with a podcast name like Undragoned, there's a connection, and a reason I would be interested in having you on. But so with the anthropology questions, we're looking at it through the lens of how can we be strong characters? How can we be, bold, courageous sons of Adam, graceful, elegant daughters of Eve in the story that the king is writing. And so I thought your book would be a great launching point to really talk about how we can really take part in the story that the king is writing.
Yeah, that's great. This is obviously one of the reasons that Lewis writes these books. He has a very particular sort of philosophy of education. He recognized even in his own day, sort of the seeds of subjectivism and the rot. He called it the poison of subjectivism. It was working its way through Western culture, and how this was going to be very, very harmful to what it means to be human. And so he writes, essays about that sort of stuff, and sort of logically dismantles the incoherence of a world in which there's no absolute truth, no objective moral order. But everything is up for grabs, and everything is Play-Doh, and human beings can just manipulate it whatever way they want. So he saw that as sort of like the modern progressive project. And then he says there's this older one called what he called the Tao. And to live in the Tao is basically to live within the objective, rational, and moral order of the universe, and to recognize that reality just is a certain way, and that human beings ought to conform themselves to it. And so what it means, so he actually says in Abolition of Man, his little book on this, in the book Abolition of Man, what it means to be human is to conform not just your mind, your mental activities, but your emotions and your heart and your sort of ways of being to the way the world actually is. So when we conform ourselves to reality, he says, and we do it with both the head and the heart, that's what makes us human. And so that's sort of his vision of sort of baseline anthropological reality, which he commands. And he says, in the ancient world, Plato, Aristotle, all of the Greeks, those sort of guys, and then the Christian tradition, this is a universal thing. Conforming yourself to the way the world is, loving what you ought to love, hating what you ought to hate, liking what you ought to like, all of those right responses to reality just is what makes us human. That's what humanity is. So that's this one piece. Now, the Narnia thing then comes in as he goes, how do you do that? Well, one of the ways is you could lecture, and that has some value. There's some catechetical value. There's just discussion and talking and sort of direct didactic. But he also knew that like the way that children actually are formed and shaped, and quite frankly, adults as well, is through stories and narratives, that we become like those things that we admire in the stories that we tell. And so he writes, one of the reasons he writes the Narnian Chronicles is precisely to show those objective realities and the human responses, the right human responses and the wrong human responses to them, as a way of holding up for imitation to children. And then as children grow up, they're sort of being discipled into the universal and objective moral order. And not only that, but into the Christian faith as well, because the Christian faith basically offers the answer to our failure to obey and conform to that objective moral order. So there is an order. We ought to respond to it. We don't respond to it properly. We don't love what we ought to love. We don't hate what we ought to hate. And therefore we're sinners. And then Christianity comes along and says, Jesus deals with all of that. And so these stories are ways of expressing both that moral order, but also the graciousness in response in very concrete, particular characters, storylines, arcs, narratives, the whole bit, so that we learn to love it as children and then grow up to imitate it as adults.
Yeah, and just want to say there just for a second, just because, Abolition of Man is a fantastic, a treatise, right? It's
right.
He's kind of goes through and just dismantles the whole relativistic framework and really kind of foresees where culture is going because of that. But honestly, to your point about stories, even though it's a brilliant book, it probably the Narnia Chronicles, his other works are a little bit more far-reaching in terms of shaping humans, just because stories, to your point, they really shape us and they conform us to an image. I mean, that's why, for example, there's so much conversation, especially in the Christian world, about Disney right now and where they're trending, and some of the things that they're including in their stories. And I mean, like, is it really a big deal that there's some political some woke political stuff in stories? Well, yeah, because our children will eat it up, and it kind of shapes them in the long run, whether we know it or not. And so, like, just your point, like, I think Narnia has a more lasting power to really direct the trajectory of someone who's trying to figure out where they are in the universe, trying to just answer all those bigger questions as they're growing up. That makes sense.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Well, so first question for you, and I want to start here, even though, despite what HarperCollins says, this is not the first book in the Chronicle, but I want to start with The Magician's Nephew and two characters there. So we have Uncle Andrew, the magician, and Jadis, the White Witch. So you have a chapter in your book kind of detailing about why these are characters that are dangerous, and really they're part of the reason why there's a need for strong characters to counter what they're doing. So I kind of want to talk about that real quick. So, like, why is it so important for us to? You kind of already touched on this, but why is it so important for us to counter? Or first off, what are Uncle Andrew and Jadis, those types? What are they trying to accomplish? And then why is it so important to push back against it?
Yeah. So both of those characters, both those characters are representative of the impulse that Lewis assaults in The Abolition of Man, what he calls the tyranny of the conditioners. Basically, those who view nature as something to be conquered and shaped according to human wishes and desires, which boils down at some level to kind of like basic impulses and instincts. So basically, what do human beings, what do you want? And then shape reality, and including use other people, manipulate other people, crush other people in order to do what you want. And so there's a kind of a desire to sort of lift oneself above the mass of humanity, to put oneself in a class of your own, and to say, this is what Jadis is. She's sort of the end product. She's where the whole thing ends. So if you work back from there and you say, Jadis, as the Queen of Charn, basically saw everyone as pawns in her game. Everything exists to serve her needs, her desires. She's the great queen. And if that means billions need to die, then billions need to die. If she's going to utter the deplorable word and wipe out all of reality, all of her planet, she can do that because she's the great queen. So she's sort of like this, I am a god, a goddess, and everything exists to serve me. And then when you work that back, you see the same basic impulse in Uncle Andrew as the magician, who basically thinks I can use Diggory and Polly to like use in my experiments. I can use animals to kind of, so Lewis actually thought that some of the ways the modern scientific enterprise was oriented in the way that it used animals was really dehumanizing, because if you'll do it to a cat, it won't be too long before you'll do it to a person. And so Uncle Andrew does it to hamsters first, and then he brings Diggory and Polly in, and he views them as objects. They're not people. They're not humans. They're not beings with a claim upon him. They are simply tools to be used for his own ends. And so he's got the same mentality. It's just a smaller form, and he doesn't have as much power. So it's the same mentality that Jadis has. She just had like legit magic, serious magic, deplorable word magic. He's just got little rings right now, but it's the same basic impulse. And then what the real brilliance, I think, of this whole this story on this issue is that the same impulse is present in Diggory in an even smaller sort of like seed-like form. So if you think of it as like seed, sapling, tree, Jadis is the tree, full grown, bearing bad fruit left and right, and you can see evil in its sort of full ugliness and pride and arrogance and wickedness. In Uncle Andrew, you can see it. You're like, yeah, we don't like that guy. He's creepy. We don't like it. But he's not as intimidating as she is, because he doesn't have the power that she does. But the real trick is, can we learn to recognize it in Diggory? And if we can recognize it in Diggory, can we recognize it in ourselves? That same desire to be as gods, to put oneself above other people, to use and manipulate according to your own ends, not according to sort of the integrity with which God has made other beings. That's the real kind of arc. And by having sort of those three, that progression in those characters, Lewis is basically offering us a warning. Like, this is where this is headed unless you repent. And which Diggory does. Diggory says he's sorry to Polly. He's wrong. He admits it. I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have rung the bell. I shouldn't have, crossed the limits that were established there. I was wrong. Please forgive me. And she forgives him. And so there you have sort of the acknowledgement of sin, the graciousness, because otherwise this, they'll reap what they sow, and it will get really, really bad.
Yeah. And it goes back to the garden, did God really say, trying to be a God ourselves? It's kind of also,
that's actually a really good point about that story too, is Lewis's inclusion of sort of the Garden of the Hesperides, which is a Greek sort of mythological echo perhaps of Eden, in this particular story is very intentional, because he needs Diggory, who, he rang the bell despite the warning. So he crossed the boundary he shouldn't have crossed, and he woke Jadis up, set her loose on his own, on Earth, and it was bad. And then as a result, when she gets into Narnia, she sows evil into Narnia. And so now, after his repentance, now he gets to go and get the fruit, and then he's faced with sort of like the worst form of this temptation, which is, you could really do some good. You could heal your mother. You could heal your mother if you just take this fruit and you go give it to her rather than go give it to Aslan. And so don't obey him. So this is the witch's temptation. Don't obey him. Just do what you want. And it's that. And this is recognizing that the desire to do good can be so easily corrupted, and that we're willing to do a little evil in order to do some good. We can, as Paul says, let's go on sinning. Shall we go on sinning so that grace can abound? Hey, can we do a little evil in order that good may come? That's such a potent temptation for people to just fudge and cut corners and do it wrong in hope of doing some greater good. And Lewis is trying to say that's not the way out. Obedience, hard obedience, is always the way.
Yeah, for sure. And it also reminds me, I just finished up Paralandra, the second in Lewis's Ransom trilogy, and it kind of reminds me of when the Unman is trying to tempt the Green Lady, and him and Ransom are going back and forth about that. And it's just kind of, to your point, he uses great tactics. They're corrupted, of course, a little bit and twisted, but the enemy is not, the enemy can camouflage its purposes, and Diggory almost fell prey to it. You know, the Green Lady was close to falling prey to it as well. But so the desire to be God's desires to write our own stories. That's a struggle that we always have, the temptation that we always fight against, and we have to. In the episode before this, Dr. Rigney kind of talked about how we have to understand that this is not our story. We need to really know that we're characters in a story, but we're not the storytellers, and that's just the constant struggle that we have. And so, moving to into some character questions then. So, obviously with anthropology and the fight today, preserving the sanctity of manhood and womanhood is at the forefront, right? Especially for Christians, like that's our hill to die on. Marriage and all that sort of stuff. So in your book, I mean, there are a number of characters that you go into throughout all 7 of the Chronicles, and kind of showcase their strength. I kind of want to go from male characters to then female characters later on. So starting with masculinity, let's chat a little bit about some of the strong sons of Adam that you wrote about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the one that my mind always goes to at first is King Loon. Probably still my favorite character in all of the Chronicles. Puddleglum comes close, so I go back and forth there. But Loon, it's probably still Loon, and the reason is because of the way that he embodies masculinity, godly masculinity, which is basically a kind of strength under authority for the good of others. And so there's a real strength and a sacrificial responsibility, or it's a strength exercised in sacrifice for the good of others, and with glad-heartedness. It's not dour, it's not severe. It can be severe. It can come down, it can drop a hammer, it can give you the look that says, you better not do that again. But the dominant note is joy, not somberness or something like that, dourness. And so Loon really embodies this well. And it begins with just his mentality of, I'm a man under authority. I can't, there's a law that's over the king. The king's not over. This is to the last point we talked about, right? He doesn't think like Jadis. He doesn't think that things exist to serve him. He thinks I exist to serve. I am here for the good of others. I am here to pour myself out, and to love and care for others, to provide, to protect. And there's a law that is over. I may be the king of Arkenland, but there's a law that's over me that I'm in submission to, and that I don't have the authority to abrogate. So I think it starts there, and then there's a competence. He's valiant and knows what to do in battle, but he also knows what to do in multiple different settings. And I think this is one of Lewis's brilliance. I actually I have a theory. So I teach literature at Bethlehem College, and I teach Shakespeare as one of the main authors I teach in our Great Books program. And I think that the horse and his boy story is Lewis pulled a lot of things from Shakespeare's play Henry V. And one of the things that Henry is known for in that play is his ability to sort of be all things to all people in a good way. He's able to recognize different circumstances. When he needs to be the orator, he can be the orator. When he needs to be sort of the football coach, like, let's go, men, take the hill, the sort of classic, Braveheart type scene or Gladiator type scene where, the once more into the breach, dear friends, once more. Henry does that. When it's time to woo the princess, he can woo the princess. When his men are discouraged, he can, go down and encourage them and buck them up. And so Henry V is this sort of mirror. He's called in the play the mirror of every Christian king. And I think Lewis drew upon him in crafting Loon, because it's the same thing that Loon does. He's valiant in battle, but he also knows how to behave in a court. He also gets his hands dirty, knows how to work with the dogs and take care of them. He's able to correct his son, but he's also able to love and give his son big hugs. And so he adapts himself in appropriate ways to all of the right circumstances. There's a kind of competence, tactfulness, wisdom, and sober-mindedness that he embodies that's beautiful. And he does it with a smile on his face, right? So the famous line famous. I say famous. It's my favorite, so that's why that's why I think it's famous. When he tells Shasta, this is what it means to be a king, to be first in every desperate attack, to be last in every desperate retreat, and when there's hunger in the land, as must be now and again in bad years, to wear finer clothes and to laugh louder at a scantier meal than any man in your land. And so it's that first in, last out. So I'm going to be the first in. I'm going to sacrifice. I'm going to be the tip of the spear, but I'm also going to be the last out. I'm going to be the one who's make sure everybody else makes it out okay. But I'm going to do it with a smile on my face. So when things are hard, I'm not going to. I'm writing a book right now on courage, and in Deuteronomy, I think it's Deuteronomy 20. Moses tells the people of Israel when they're going into war, if any of the men are faint-hearted or fearful, they need to go home. They're not allowed to go to war, lest they make the hearts of their fellows melt like their own. So cowardice is contagious. And Loon knows this. So he knows, hey, if there's hard times in the land, if there's famine, if it's hunger, if things aren't looking great, then to see the king's face fall and for him to be discouraged is just everybody else is going to collapse. He's got to actually rise to the challenge and laugh louder at a scantier meal. He's got to be the one who with faith in God goes, it's all right, everybody. We're going to be okay. God's got us, in order to lift the spirits of those around him. And that's, I think, a beautiful picture of godly masculinity. That's what men are for. That's what they ought to be. And Loon's the character that embodies that as well as any.
Yeah, I think that's so important, especially nowadays. We're at war with a host of enemies. And sometimes when we're in like that wartime mindset, we kind of become, essentially we have tunnel vision, and we have one note, but being able to have, diversity, gravitas, being able to kind of adapt to what as what you're saying. I mean, that's so important. Like the way that I would speak to, an unbeliever on the street is not how I should, speak to my wife or my kids. It's a whole different thing. You got to understand the situation. And to that point, like for those, especially I'm familiar with King Loon, I mean, he's obviously a king of a kingdom. And so might not be in the exact same situation, but, being able to laugh at hardships, being able to endure, I think is especially important for men, just because, we really set the tone in the household in particular. Right.
Right. So, so I've got sons, and my two oldest are 13 and 11 and play youth baseball. And so this is how I talk to them during games. I want them to be leaders on their team. I want them to be godly men. And so when things get hard, somebody makes an error, maybe they strike out or something goes wrong and the game's not going their way, the other team's doing really well. It's easy for the face to fall. It's easy. This is the equivalent of the scanty meal. This is the equivalent of the famine, right? The other team just scored 3 runs on an error and now we're losing. And it's like in that moment, what I'm exhorting my boys to do is to do this, right? To, be sober-minded, stable, secure, brave, courageous, and stay up, like laugh, smile, enjoy yourself, have fun, be the emotional leader of the team. That's what I want them to grow up into that, which is hard. It's hard for a 40-year-old, let alone an 11-year-old or a 13-year-old to do that. But it's actually one of the main reasons that I want them playing sports. This is what sports can do for them, is give them opportunities to have that pressure, to have that hardship and that endurance in a particular setting, to develop that fortitude of mind and resolution and gravitas and joy in order to endure. Because someday it's not going to be baseball games. It's going to be something more serious. And I want them to be practiced and ready to go.
Yeah, that's so good. And as the anchor for our soul, we have the gospel as well. We have that eschatological hope, knowing that what the world doesn't have is that idea of hope. So we can laugh, we can be merry, we can have feasts, because we know in the end there is a happy ending.
Yeah,
that's really, really solid. You mentioned our favorite Marshwiggle.
Yeah,
and talk about Puddleglum real quick.
Yeah, so Puddleglum's a great character. He doesn't. Everybody thinks of him as sort of like the sour-faced Marshwiggle because he's so pessimistic about everything.
Yeah.
He's based on Lewis's gardener. The gardener was the sort of guy who always, if it was sunny, he knew there was going to be a storm. And there's a great story about the first time Lewis was going to go get on an airplane. He and his wife Joy were going to get an airplane, and the gardener came up to the car window as they were getting ready to drive off and said, Mr. Lewis, I just heard on the wireless that a plane went down in Spain or something like that. And, can you believe that you're going to get on a plane and the plane just went down? Well, have a great trip. And just send him off with that kind of word, with those kind of words of encouragement, but the thing that Lewis finds admirable about Puddleglum is his steadiness, right? Is that, on the one hand, he can be a little bit, cynical is not the right word. He's not cynical. He can be so sort of realistic. He can be pessimistic. He can always the glass is always half empty. That sort of mentality. But it also means he's the sort of guy that you want in a foxhole when the chips are down and it's cold and rainy and you're tired and you don't think you can go anymore. Who's the guy that's going to be able to help you get through it? A guy like Puddleglum. And he demonstrates that kind of courage in the interaction with the Green Witch when he goes and sticks his foot in the fire. He knows, like, hey, I got to clear my head. And that incense that's burning and the music that's humming is keeping us from thinking clearly. And so he struggles and struggles and struggles, and he goes and sticks his foot in the fire, and burnt marshmallow smells nasty. And so as a result of that, it clears the head. And all of a sudden people are able to think clearly. And so that took a lot of courage. It was painful. It was hardship. And then he just used the sort of defiance of, you may be right. Maybe there's no Narnia, but we're going to go look anyway. And he remembers in the darkness what he knew in the light. He remembers that, hey, I've been to Narnia. I'm from Narnia. It's my home. It's real. And we're going to go find it now. And so that kind of like mature defiance in the face of evil, in the face of unbelief, in the face of the kind of cloudy environment and foggy doubts that can kind of cloud in. That's another picture of masculinity, which is why we shouldn't make masculinity mainly about personality type or something like that, right? So King Loon and Puddleglum, in terms of their personalities, are about as close to polar opposite as you can be. Big, jolly, fat-cheeked king, and then like thin as a rail, sourpuss who's always, looking on the dark side of life. And it's like you've got both of those as pictures of the same basic, godly masculinity.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's so good. Sorry, my doorbell ring. So a little awkward, but I think it's just a package. No big deal. But yeah,
No
Puddleglum is definitely one of my favorite characters. Silver Chair is my favorite Narnia Chronicle. What he does, he definitely has no filter, right? He just kind of says whatever he wants. And he's realistic about things, right? Which can, it did scare Jill and Eustace to a degree at times, but yeah, having a guy like that in the trenches is absolutely vital for sure. One of my favorite chapters of the book, it might be my favorite chapter of the book. This chapter, and then the one on chivalry. I really love the one on chivalry as well. It's called, The Glory of a Narnian Queen. And so this is your portion of the book devoted to some of the ladies in the Chronicles of Narnia, some of the most beloved ones like Lucy and Susan. You kind of talk about godly femininity and what that looks like in the Chronicles. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that is really great about the books is that the Lewis knows that virtue is virtue, right? So goodness is goodness, whatever form it takes. But as men and women, the same virtues will be inflected. They'll be sort of refracted through the way God has built us as men, which is different than the way he's built us as women. And it'll be refracted there. And so the virtue will be there and recognizable, but it will be appropriate to the gender, to the sexuality. So in this case, I think one of the big ones is courage, right? We think of courage, frequently we'll think of courage as sort of a masculine virtue. And there's ways in which that's true. So that sort of the be the man, the first in, last out, laughing loudest sort of idea is there's a particular masculine expression of that virtue of courage. But on the other hand, courage is not a masculine virtue. It's just a virtue. And the courage displayed by a number of the female characters in their own way is remarkable. I think of, for example, one of them, a great example would be Lucy in Prince Caspian, when Aslan has appeared to her, she can see him, but nobody else can. And so they're trying to go, and she's like, Aslan says to come. And she's like, Aslan says to go, guys. And they're like, no, we're going to go this way instead. And this is a moment where, she's not in charge. She's not the high king. She's not, right. She's not the male lead character. She's not the King Loon character. Instead, she's the little sister. But she's expected to have courage here anyway. And so she says, I'm going to obey Aslan and not the high king, right? So here's the good example of there's a higher law than the king's law. I should obey the king. I should honor the king and respect Peter, my older brother, but he's not God. He's not Aslan. And I'm going to obey Aslan, not him, if it comes down to it. And she does. And that takes a lot of courage. It takes, in some ways, that's one of the greatest manifestations of courage is to be able to displease those that you care about and whose opinion you value, even when it's hard. And so that's a great example of sort of the courage of a Narnian queen. You also see kind of throughout the Chronicles, the wisdom and influence, the sort of the godly influence of the female characters on the male characters, that they typically have a way of bringing out some of the male characters' own their own virtues, so they challenge them in appropriate ways. So you think about Polly and Diggory is a good example. You think about Jill and Eustace as another example. The relationship between those two characters demonstrates that men only become what God intends for them to be in the presence of women, right? There's a place for male fraternity, but women can draw out things in men that wouldn't come out otherwise, and vice versa. So the men can draw out things from the women that wouldn't be there. And so there's a this is why we talk about complementarity, right? Like there's a complementarity here between these two that Lewis is very sensitive and aware of. And so, I'm trying to think of other examples. So I think, Susan actually has to show bravery in Prince Caspian as well, which is the story that really is the war story. It requires it. And she's timid and fearful, and she needs Aslan to breathe on her, but she's got to become bold. She actually has to become courageous in order to be the queen.
Yeah. Another example that you brought up in the book was Aravis from The Horse and His Boy.
Oh yeah, Aravis.
And the idea about clothing.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a scene that some people really, some critics really don't like this scene. But it's in The Horse and His Boy, Aravis, if she lived today, everybody would call her a tomboy. Because she's more interested in battles and things like that than the typical girl. And so at one point she comes across her friend Lasserline, who's very flighty. If we were going to characterize her, she's sort of the valley girl. She's the dits and all that kind of stuff. And so they're friends sort of. And when they're together, Lasserline just wants to sort of prattle on about superficial things and who's wearing what and who the important people are and all that kind of stuff. And Aravis is like, hey, this is I'm in a tough spot. This is life and death. I'm trying to escape here. If I get caught, I'm dead. I'm with these other people, all of these like really heavy, weighty things. And so she's not interested in talking about clothes. And so she has to kind of cut through it and get Lasserline to focus. But then later, so that's one part. But then later, when she meets Queen Lucy for the first time, Lucy braces her like a sister, and then takes away, and the girls, and they go and talk about what they're going to wear for the great ball. They're going to wear really nice clothes. And so now all of a sudden it's perfectly appropriate for her to be interested in what she's going to wear and how she's going to look and how she's going to present, and sort of the glory of feminine beauty, like that focus on glorification and beautification, which women often excel at, is a totally appropriate thing. It's just not an appropriate thing in a life or death situation like Lasserline is doing. That's superficial, but in its proper place, it's good. And Lewis is commending it as, don't think that just because she's sharp, shrewd, courageous, and brave, that she's not a woman. and
Right.
that you can combine those things together and not have to pick one.
Yeah. Dr. Rigney, I really enjoyed this interview. And final question for you. Softball. I already told you mine, a silver chair, but what is your favorite Narnia Chronicle and why?
Yeah, it shifts probably based on mood and life situation and things like that. But at one time I would have said Horse and His Boy. I think I'd probably say Silver Chair now as well. And a lot of it has to do with the that final sort of scene with Puddleglum and the kids in Underland, sort of fighting the White Witch and the unbelief. I think the way that Lewis talks about the struggle there, displays the struggle to believe in the dark, is a really beautiful picture of faith, and the overall focus of the book on remember the signs, and the need to sort of soak yourself in what God says, what Aslan says, as a way of steeling yourself for hardship, so that you don't get distracted, you don't get taken off mission. I think there's a lot of really beautiful things in the Silver Chair that Lewis brings out. So I think that's probably my favorite at the moment.
Sweet. We have the same
go.
favorite then. Awesome. Yeah. A Horse and His Boy is great too. It's over, it's the most popular one, so it's overused, but The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is just a great story.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. Well, awesome. I have really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And if there's, I hear you mentioned that you're writing a book on courage. Do you know when that's when
I
you
would
anticipate
guess,
that to come out?
knowing how publishers work, my guess is sometime next summer. So I'm still in the middle of writing it, so it's not even into the publisher yet. But I would guess sometime next summer with Crossway.
Awesome. Well, in the meantime, Dr. Rigney has other great books. We talked about The Things of Earth a while ago on this pod. It's a great one. You guys should, for those listening, you definitely should buy his books and read them. There's 4 of them, right? There's Things of Earth, Strangely Bright. There's one on men and pornography, if I remember correctly.
Yes, more than a battle.
That's it.
And then Lewis and the Christian Life. Yep.
Got it. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Rigney.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.